Hello everyone, I'm Dave Thomas, and today I am building the Grappler mid-power model rocket. This is put out by Dyna-Star, which is a line of mid-power rockets that Apogee Components acquired, so somewhere along the line this is an Apogee kit as well. It's a fairly large model rocket that flies on 24mm motors, which means that you can use something like a D12-3 here and have a fairly small field. Okay, so this has an estimated altitude of just under 300 feet, which is great if you're restricted to a smaller field, but you want a big rocket to fly there. Okay, so as always, we will open this up and make sure we have all of our parts. Find the instructions here, and there are things folded up within the instructions, so be careful as you take those out so we don't lose them. Okay, so first of all we have 3 sheets of fin stock, and it looks like we're going to be making a complex fin here. Then we've got a sheet of centering rings. See what else is inside here. Okay, I think that's all. Yep. Alright, so then we'll just look at our parts list here. Alright, we've got one big body tube and another big body tube. Okay. Now, one thing I can see right away here that I don't like is that these body tubes are not pre-slotted. If you got fins this big and body tubes like this, there's no reason not to pre-slot the body tubes. Alright, but we'll go with it. Okay, coupler for the tubes, big plastic nose cone. Okay, that looks like our engine mount tube. We've got this yellow tube here. What is this? I'm not quite sure because it's actually going over the motor mount tube here. So it looks like a reinforcement, but I don't see... Oh, yellow engine mount sleeve. There we go, right on the top. Alright, so that's what that is. Alright, we've got a Kevlar shock cord here. Parachute kit with string and reinforcements as well as the plastic sheet. Okay, we've got 2 rings here. Okay, so that one and should be 2. Oh, there's no one. Alright. So we've got 2 green centering rings here, and it looks like they're going to use this as an engine block, is my guess. We've got a 1/4-inch launch lug and an engine retainer. Now, this looks like it's supposed to have 2 retainer clips, although I'm not sure how that would work. I have not seen a second one in the kit. So I'm going to hope that's just a typo, because I don't see how you would use a shorter one and a longer one at the same time. Okay, now there should be a decal sheet in here. Let's check the tubes. Yeah, here we go. Always got to check the tubes. And yes, we've got some self-adhesive decals here that were up inside one of the body tubes. Okay, come back and check our list again. Instructions. Looks like we've got everything here. Okay, so I'm going to clear most of this away and then we will get started on the build. Now, one of the things that came with my kit was this modification sheet, and this replaces some of the steps in the instructions. Okay, so the first thing here has to do with the fins. Apparently these used to be balsa fins that were single pieces. Now they are basswood or basswood in 2 pieces that you glue together here. Okay, so this gives you a little bit heavier fin, but a little sturdier. And again, especially since it is a heavier fin, I really wish they would have made these with through-the-wall fin tabs. But we'll do it the way they've got it here. The other change has to do with the motor mount. Okay, so what it looks like they've done is just not include the shorter motor mount here. So what they were calling the D size motor mount. This is just the E size, so it's the same length as a standard Estes 24mm E motor, and they've revised the motor mount assembly accordingly. And that's what I would have done anyway, because you can still use the 24mm D and C11 size motors by simply putting a ring adapter up inside that. Okay, Estes sells these individually and also with their motor reducer sets. You can also make your own by simply cutting off a 24mm motor casing to the right length here. And so you just slide this up in front of the motor, and then you can put a D12, for example, into this without having to have a different engine hook. Okay, so what we will do then is we're going to start with the fins. Okay, so in the instructions they have us sanding these before we take them out of the stock material, so I will go ahead and do that. They recommend a 400 grit sandpaper. You might want to start with something a little more coarse. 400 seems a lot for initial sanding here. I'm going to use some 220, and here I just use a small wood block here. You don't need anything fancy. Alright, and we're just going to sand both faces of these basically till we don't see these scorch marks anymore. So that gives it some initial smoothness here. Now, because we are going to glue these together, I'll do some finer sanding after that's done, because we have some raised edges or some just excess glue and things like that that need to be gotten rid of. I'm going to go ahead and sand these other two off camera and then come back. I now have all of these sanded and vacuumed to get rid of the dust there. And so now we're simply going to take a hobby knife here and just cut through the little remaining nubs there from the laser cutting process. And some of these, like this part's already trying to come off. Alright, it may just fall off. Oop, bad blade there, I think. Okay, and sometimes they just fall out. Now this one's got a little bit left on it. There we go. Now I'm going to take the three of each of those pieces there and stack them together. And initially here I'm going to take some 150 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to stack these together and run the edges over, and this will get rid of the remainder of those little laser cutting bits, because we want nice smooth square edges here, at least initially. I'll do the same thing with the smaller pieces here. Alright, now I want to be careful about these edges here that are going to interact with each other, so we don't want to get them too small. Alright, so now I'm just going to dry fit these and make sure that they do indeed fit together. Okay, they're tight, but they do. Now, when this goes on to the model here, they go on like this, so the fins are actually raked forward like a grappling hook, hence the name. Okay, so that's the way it's going to go together there. And so I'm going to go ahead here and dry fit the others. Okay, come back to our little instruction sheet here. Alright, so I'm going to take these apart again. And for this part, I recommend doing it on a piece of wax paper so you don't end up gluing the fin to your surface. Okay, so I'm just going to do one as a demonstration, and then I'll do the other ones off camera. Alright, so here we're going to want some wood glue. Probably not the really thick kind. We actually do want this to flow a little bit. And we don't want a whole lot, because most of this is just going to get pressed out anyway. And so if we start with a lot, that just means we have to clean up more. But do make sure we get the edges here. Okay, and we're going to go back to pushing this down. Alright, and then take a rag, tissue, paper towel, whatever, and immediately wipe away the excess glue there. Now we'll check the other side as well. Okay. Now because of the way we press this in, this is not being filled with glue, kind of the same way that this is. Now we will have the option of applying some sanding sealer to this at a later stage, and you can also apply some wood filler if needed to hide the seams there. Okay, so I'm going to go off camera and do the other two, and then we'll come back. All of the fins are drying now, and I just realized I said something incorrect here. Alright, so if you're paying attention closely, and you've done these before, you should remember that we always have the grain of wood fins parallel to the leading edge. Well, this is the parallel edge, and so they are raked forward, but not the way I had them. So they're going to go on like this, where the root edge is nearly perpendicular to the grain. Okay, clear that up, let these dry some more, and then we're going to start working on the engine mount. For the engine mount, we're going to need the engine mount tube here, the reinforcement sleeve, these 3 rings, and our engine clip initially. Now you might be wondering why this is so long. Okay, because 24mm motors aren't this long. And the reason for that is this is what's called a stuffer tube. And basically once we get the big rings around this, it seals off the lower part of the rocket from the ejection gases. So that instead of trying to expand the entire volume of the rocket, it's only trying to expand about half of it. And so this just gives us a more reliable ejection by having that tube extend up through the first half of the rocket. Alright, so here we're going to need our revised instructions. And the first thing we're going to do is make a mark at 82 millimeters or 3¼ inches from the aft end. Okay, so I'm going to go down here, find 82 millimeters, because I tend to be metrically inclined. I'm just going to make a little mark right there. Okay, and then we're going to take a hobby knife here and cut that about 3 millimeters, or 1/8 inch, just long enough for the right angle part of our engine clip to pop in there. So now we're going to make 2 more marks here. One at 2½ inches or 63 millimeters. Okay. So 63 is right there. And then another one at 1⅛ inch or 29 millimeters. Right there. Okay, now we're going to glue this yellow tube on, but first I'm just going to friction fit things and see how everything goes together. Alright, so when this is installed, it will be at this upper mark. Okay, so these marks are not to scale. Okay, and then one of the green rings here is going to go also on the aft end. Okay, and that is going to go up. Alright, so that's going to go to the rear of the mark there. So when this is all put together, it's going to look like that. Now I'm going to check my measurement here. As I said, this looks to be not to scale, so I'm going to double check and make sure this is actually where I think it is. So that should be at 63 millimeters, and it is. Okay, so it's just the drawing, not my measurements. Okay, so I'm going to now back this off a little bit here. Actually, I'm going to back it all the way off. Okay, and here I'm going to apply some glue. Okay, and that says for a 2-inch length just forward. That's a lot of glue. All right, so we're just going to, I'm going to put a thin layer here, like that. And then we're going to pop this up just until we get that mark right there. Okay, and anything that got pushed forward, you can just kind of wipe with your finger here into a small fillet, like that. Okay, we're going to make sure that's straight. And go ahead and put this ring back on there. Okay, and this is going to go around the tube with a bead of glue. It's not a big deal if you get a little bit on the metal there. Okay, and we're going to push this forward until the mark is on the aft edge of the ring. Right there. Okay, and once more, just any excess there you can make into a fillet with your finger like that. Okay, and so now we can go back to the regular instructions for the rest of this. Okay, so that brings us to this point. So now we're going to take the card here of centering rings, and these should just pop right out. If they're not wanting to pop out, just go around them with your hobby knife. Okay, so we're going to have one of these that will go pretty much right in the middle. So we are going to measure, that is not 17.8 meters, that is 17.8 centimeters, or 7.5 inches from the forward end. Alright, so 17.8 centimeters is going to be right here. Okay, so I'm going to dry fit one of these rings just to make sure it's where it needs to be. So that's going to go right there. Now, I just had a little video blip where I lost the last 30 seconds or so of the clip I was working on. So what I've done here is put the middle ring back down on that mark, and I've put fillets on either side of that, and so that's currently drying. And then what we're going to do next is take one of the other rings, make sure this little notch is cut out. It may or may not have fallen out already. And that's going to go back here, and that notch goes over our engine clip, and we're going to glue that so that it's on that half-inch mark that we made earlier. Okay, so here I'm going to once again add a bead of glue. Alright, and here you want to try to avoid hitting the metal if you can. It's not a big deal if you get some on there. Okay, and again we'll try and get that perpendicular, and then we'll add some more glue here to form fillets. Smooth that in. Okay, and we'll do the same on the back side, or actually this would be the front side. I did get some on the metal that time. Again, it's not a big deal. Okay. Okay, and now we're going to measure 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters from the forward end of the tube here. That'll place it right here. Alright, and now we're going to take the other of the larger green rings, right there, and we're going to cut a notch in this about halfway through the thickness, and try and do it in an area that doesn't have an overlap like this. So try and get a nice boring blank area of the inside there. We're just going to cut a notch here that will be just big enough to allow the shock cord to go through it. Okay, so now we're going to take our shock cord, okay, you can just pull the tape off or break it there. Go ahead and bring this out. Okay, now if you got some fraying here, which the Kevlar tends to do, it doesn't hold onto itself very well. It doesn't hold knots very well. If you want, you can just coat this with a little bit of either wood glue, or you can use some super glue on it. Alright, so I like to use the latter. So just some regular viscosity super glue. And what you do is just put a drop or two on there, starting where it's still intact. Alright, and then you can take a tissue and just pull that through. Okay, so we're not looking for strength here, we just want this to dry quickly. And then once you've done that, you can take, if you want a little bit of alcohol or other super glue accelerator here, try not to make a mess. Okay, put that on there. Blows through, and then you can take your hobby knife and just cut off the frayed area. Just like that. And you don't have to do this, it just makes it a little bit easier to work with. Alright, so next I'm going to tie a slip knot here, okay, which is basically an overhand knot around the string itself. Alright, so that slips. And then we're going to take our engine mount tube here, and this is simply going to get lassoed around that to begin with. Okay, and we're going to take our slotted one here. We're going to feed the other end of the shock cord through that ring, and then that's going to go here with the shock cord going through that little notch. Let me see if I can get around this and keep it in focus. Alright, so just kind of pull the ring around there. Okay, just have a little patience as you do so. And then feed that down. There we go. Alright, now I'm going to look for my 1/2 inch mark once more. There it is. Alright, so here I'm going to take some more wood glue. Alright, I'm going to put a bead around there. And it's okay if you get it on the shock cord, because we're actually going to embed this into the shock cord. This is going to go down until the 1/2 inch mark is on the forward edge of the ring. Alright, where to go? That should be it right about there. Alright, now I'm going to just pull on the shock cord here until it's up against the ring. I'm going to put a little bit more glue around that and just completely encase that shock cord in glue. You can just smooth it into a fillet there, and that's just going to lock it into place really well. Okay. Now, I don't like the way they did this last part here. Alright, so now what we need to do is stick our engine block all the way down inside there, okay, until it rests on top of the engine hook down in there. Alright, and I'm pretty sure you won't be able to see it down there as it's so dark. And what they suggest is using a dowel to shove it down there, and then using some glue on the dowel to glue it into place. I don't see a good alternative to that, unfortunately. So I guess we'll go with it. Alright, so I need to find a dowel here. So here I have a dowel. Now we're going to slide this in. Alright, now the trick here is to kind of rotate that dowel around so you're always getting the same, more or less the same. It's going to want to try and go sideways. Actually, for much of the distance, you probably can do that without any problem. take this from the other end. Again, you may not be able to see this just because of the position of the light. I can almost grab it, but not quite. Okay, so we'll go back to using our dowel here. There I'm contacting the top of the clip. Now you might be tempted to put the glue in from the underside. I don't recommend doing that because any excess could run down inside here and interfere with the motor. So what they're telling us to do is to put some glue on the dowel and run it down. I'm trying to see here. Probably use the thickest glue you have for this. Alright, so I'm going to put my dowel in my glue here. I think I want quite that much. Okay. Then I'm going to stick this down basically until I hit the top of that ring. I'm going to smear this around a bit. And most of it's just smearing around the tube, so you may want to try this more than once. Just don't get so much that it goes over the engine mount ring, or the engine block ring, and into the lower part of the tube. Alright, I'm going to let this dry completely before we try installing it. And I'm going to put it so that it is up on its forward end. Oh, we've got some glue coming out of there already. Okay, so I've got glue, but I don't want it. Alright, so now we'll hang this up like that and let it dry. And once this is fully dry, we'll mount it inside the body tube. While I'm waiting for the glue to dry on the motor mount, I'm going to return my attention to the fins here. And first make sure they're pretty flat. Well, there's not much you can do about them if they end up bowed or something like that. You can try putting a big book on them overnight or something like that. These look all fairly straight. Now in the instructions, they just have us smoothing these edges as a block. They don't actually tell us to do any type of rounding or airfoiling or anything like that. And actually, because of the kind of nature of this rocket, so it's supposed to be like a grappling hook here, I actually like the edges that remain here. It gives it more of a grapply appearance, in my opinion. So I am not going to round these. I'm going to make them nice and square. Now, it means it's not going to go quite as high, but as I mentioned earlier, I actually like this rocket because you can use it on a relatively small field. Now, we definitely want to get rid of these seams. You could leave them in there, but they're going to show through the paint very easily. So here you can use some wood filler, or you could use some plastic model putty. Alright, I've got this paste type wood filler here, and I'm just going to use my finger in it and just work that into the cracks and crevices here. Now if it starts to pill up too much, you can use just a little bit of water. I'm going to use a little bit of alcohol here, and that'll smooth it out a little bit. And if you want, you can dilute it even more and use it to fill in the wood grain. So if you dilute this to about 2/3 of the paste to 1/3 of water or alcohol, it becomes basically paintable, and so you can just kind of spread it onto the surfaces. Now if you use alcohol, it dries faster and is less likely to warp the wood. If you use water in it, that can cause some bending and warping there. Right, now I'm going to let this dry, and then I'll flip it over off camera and do the other side, and then we'll sand this off again. While we're waiting for glue to dry and wood filler to dry, I'm going to turn my attention to the nose cone here. Now this was molded in 2 halves, and so it has some very distinct seams here. Now this is mostly aesthetic, so you can use this nose cone as is. It'll still fly and work and everything, but you will see those seams in the paint. So if you'd like to make this a little more presentable, what you can do is first sand this with some 150 to 200 grit sandpaper. And I'm going to start with a dry sanding here. And the objective is to knock down the high portions of these seams here. And to a certain extent, you can kind of knock down the area around the low portions to make it more even. But the low portions are probably going to require some additional attention there. Okay, so first I'm just going to sand the 2 seams with 150 grit, and then I'm going to sand the entire nose cone all the way around so that it has a uniform texture to it, and then after that we'll go on to do some wet sanding to make it smoother. So I've roughened this up with 150 grit sandpaper. I have knocked down most of the high points here. Now we still have a lot of low points to worry about. Okay, and the reason I start with a dry sanding is it's easier to see what you're doing with when you're dry sanding. Wet sanding tends to be a bit more efficient and gives you a smoother finish, but you can't always see what you're doing under the water. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is move to a 220 grit and eventually up to at least a 400 grit, wet sanding this. Now if you haven't wet sanded before, you do need the wet dry sandpaper, and this is usually the stuff that's either black or purple or blue. Alright, so it looks something like this. And it's just the backing paper is water resistant so it doesn't just fall apart. And we're not actually doing this underwater. Usually I have just a little dribble of water going, and then I just wet the surface of both the sandpaper and the nose cone here, and then just sand those. And what this does is the water helps to lubricate the sandpaper over the plastic so that it sands smoother. It also washes it away. So one of the things that you'll notice here is dry sanding tends to fill up the sandpaper a lot. Wet sanding makes your sandpaper last longer. So I'm going to take this over to the sink off camera and start sanding this down to smooth it. Now again, we won't be able to get the actual gouges in here, the lower parts, but we will come back and look at some ways to fix that. Here's my nose cone after sanding first with 220 grit, then 320 grit, and then 400 grit sandpaper. Alright, now the overall finish has kind of a flat finish compared to the glossiness of the original out of the mold finish there that you can still see in the shoulder. And this is actually something good because at the microscopic level this leaves lots of surface area for the paint to adhere. Now we do still have a little bit of our seams here, and depending on just how deep these are and how much you care about it, you may not want to do anything at all at this point. I often use a filling sandable primer, and it would probably fill most of this in except maybe here at the very top. Okay, and if you don't mind having a little bit of seam showing, that's perfectly up to you as well. Now, an option though is to use something like this. This is Plastic Model Contour Putty. The one I have here is made by Testers. I know that several other brands are available. Okay, now this is water soluble. It's actually an alcohol to begin with. And you just kind of put this along the seam that you want to fill, and then just take a finger and smooth that in really quickly. It starts to dry almost immediately, and so especially around the nose here where we've got some little curves and things like that, just quickly smooth those in. Alright, it's okay if it looks rough because we'll come back and sand this. Now the drawback to this is when you go to sand it, you really can't wet sand it very easily because it would just wash away. So when you dry sand this, it tends to clog up the sandpaper a lot. So just be aware that you're going to go through a bit more sandpaper than you might expect. Alright, this takes about an hour to dry enough to sand it, so I'm going to set this aside and we're going to do some more waiting. The contour putty has dried here, and it's actually kind of crunchy there. Alright, so first of all, I'm just any of these things that are just sticking out, I'll just kind of rub off with my fingers. And then I'm going to sand this with 400 grit sandpaper. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this tends to clog up sandpaper, so you may need a couple of small pieces like this to do the whole job. Alright, this is being really slow. It looks like I'm going to need to go to some 200 and then come back up to 400. Now notice here I'm actually taking out most of the putty, and that's what we want, so that we only have a little bit left in there that's actually filling in the holes. Okay, and the trouble is sometimes you take it out too far. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my 400 grit sandpaper here and just re-smooth this. Now it may be hard to see this here. I'm going to bring this up close and hopefully it'll focus. Okay, but most of the putty now has been sanded away. We just have some little lines. And this can be repeated, so depending on how deep these gouges were on your particular nose cone and just how finished you want this to be, you can reapply some more putty, let it dry, sand it some more. Let me give it just a little bit more here. Okay. And then make sure you dust this off well so you don't have the putty dust interfering with the paint later on. Alright, so that's ready to be primed and painted. Here are my fins, and the wood filler has dried. Now some of these look like they're going to need a second application, like this is probably going to need some here. But I'm going to go ahead and sand these. First using 150. We'll come back and use 200 grit once we have everything filled in here. Now remember, you want to sand with the grain so that it's a little bit tighter here. Okay, yeah, so I can still see, let's see if we can get up here where we get in focus. You can still see the groove here, so that's probably going to need another application. We'll do the back side here. Okay, so this looks much tighter in there, and I think that's, you can see the outline, but it appears to be fully filled there. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to the other two fins, and then we'll come back and see just what needs to be refilled. Here I have them all sanded, and they're acceptable now the way they are, although I still see some roughness there. That one looks pretty good. It's just powder there. Okay, although on this one I failed to notice the knot here, and this does have some depth to it, so I'm going to go ahead and apply some to there in the back side of the knot as well. This is the one I think that had the most open, although that's filled in fairly well too. So depending on just how smooth you want the fins, we got a little bit there, just take that off. Okay, so depending on how smooth you want your fins, one layer might be good enough for you. I'm going to give this a second layer, and then instead of applying a polyurethane based sanding sealer like I often do in these videos, I'm going to thin the wood filler a bit and just kind of paint that on and use that as my sanding sealer. And then that in conjunction with a filling sandable primer should give me pretty smooth fins. Here I've already spotted that knot there with just some full strength wood filler. And now I'm going to dilute some of this. And you can use water, or I'm going to use some rubbing alcohol here. Alright, but well, there's a good sized metric blob there to start with. And now I'm going to thin this. I'm going to use some isopropyl rubbing alcohol here. And you want this to be about the consistency of wood glue or acrylic paint. I think this paper cup is going to leak too much here. I'm going to change that. Alright, so you might want to do this in a small plastic cup rather than paper. If you have a wax paper cup, it's probably fine. But these are fairly cheap, just paper ones that I normally use for epoxy. Alright, so we'll stir this one up. And it's actually, if it's a little bit lumpy, it's not going to be a big deal. We want to try and get this as smooth as possible. Okay, we can just apply that here. And here I would use an old paintbrush, or one that you really don't mind getting disgusting. This will wash out if you do it right away. Here, I'm going to use an acid paintbrush here that you normally find in welding stuff. Got a brush here coming out. Alright, well, we're just going to basically paint this across and fill in the wood grain. Now if you use water, you'll have more working time, but you also have a greater chance of warping the fin. Now even that is usually fixable by stacking a few heavy books over it. Okay. And then once that dries, here I'll do the other side. Okay, I'm just going to do the same thing here to the other two fins. Now this particular brand is more of a white color. There are others, there are lots of different manufacturers of this wood filler. Pretty much most of them are water based. And you can do this with almost any of them. So some of them actually include a little bit of wood bits in them and they have more of a wood appearance. Others are like this where they're just a single color. Okay, but I've used this method with probably at least 3 or 4 different brands and styles, and it works well with all of them. Okay, so generally about a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 parts wood filler to 1 part thinner, whether you're using water or alcohol. Alright, so I'm going to let these dry, and then once that's happened I'll flip them over and do the other side, and then I'll sand them all again, but I'll do all that part off camera. While the sanding sealer is drying on the fins, we can come back now to our engine mount, and we're about ready to put this inside the lower part of the body tube. And so the first thing I'm going to do is just get this out of the way by sliding it down inside here. The hardest part is getting it past the thrust ring there, the engine block. Try a little dowel action here. Just got it. Okay. So go ahead and pull this all the way through, and this will keep it from getting into the glue as we're mounting this up inside the body tube itself. Alright, so here we're just going to do a dry fit, make sure that I'm not going to have any problems. Kind of noisy there. Okay, that's a little bit snug back there, so I'm going to use a little bit of 150 grit sandpaper and just go around the rings here. We don't want to take off a lot at once, or we won't have good contact. Alright, but if we take off the layer that just gets rid of that sooty layer there, it's probably going to be enough. Okay, Okay. Middle one's okay, but the aft one here still needs a little bit more taken off. Okay, so that looks pretty good. The other thing we do is take a thumbnail here to the inside of the body tube and just kind of chamfer that outward a little bit. And that gets rid of any little lip that may have formed just during the cutting process. I think we'll still want to sand that a little bit more. One more time here. Okay. Now, when we have this actually mounted, we will want the two tubes flush with each other, like that. Okay. Now, what they are recommending is taking a dowel and applying glue with that 7 inches up. So I'm just going to take my dowel here, get on the right scale. Okay, so that's going to be right about here. I'm just going to make a little mark. Okay, and I'm going to take my wood glue. Okay, and I'm just going to dip this in, and I'll put my thumbnail on that 7-inch mark there. Oops, don't want quite that much. We just want it mostly on the tip. All right, I'm going to stick that up till my thumb hits, and then we're going to just smear that around the inside of the tube. Take a look there. I'm going to smear some more. And the idea here is that the middle ring will pass through that glue, and then it will go forward. Okay, so that's the first part. For the second part, I'm just going to use a cotton applicator. So now what I want to do is I'm going to insert this about to there. So I don't want it hitting the glue that's up inside quite yet. And now I'm just going to take a cotton applicator here, and I'm going to put a ring of glue just inside the end of the body tube here. And that will apply to this. So that now when we stick this in, each ring has its own glue there. Okay, and I'm just going to set that flush. Okay, now this needs to glue a little bit. We're going to have to let this dry. Okay, and we've got a nice, I don't know if we can get enough light down there to see it. Not really, but we do have a nice fillet that formed itself in there. Okay, so after this dries for probably at least 20 minutes, then we will put the final forward centering ring in through here. I'm about ready to put in the last centering ring here, and that's going to go in from the top and have to settle down on top of the motor mount there. Okay, so there's not a lot of wiggle room there, and there's not a lot of room for second chances if we mess this one up. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and sand the outside of this. I would prefer this to be a little loose and require a bit more glue than to get stuck halfway down the motor mount or stuck inside the body tube. Alright, now I've already started. I'm going to add a little more here. I'm going to cut a bit more out of the notch here. This will be for the shock cord, and it's already anchored down inside, so this can be a little bit loose if it needs to be, and then we will glue over it. Okay, and then as we did on the outside, I'm going to go ahead and sand the inside of this. I'm using a dead motor casing here to give me a round surface. Okay, so now we're going to need to pull our shock cord back out, and that's going to be threaded through our centering ring here. Alright, now this is going to get a little bit close for the camera. Let's see if I can keep this all in focus here. Alright, but first I need to get that notch where it needs to be. Okay, and I'm not going to try and pre-glue this. I'm just going to drop glue it down the top, because it is difficult here to get the inside over the motor mount tube and the outside down there. And then I'm going to use my dowel here with the motor on it. Make sure that's all in place. Alright, so now I'm going to put in a fairly heavy fillet all the way around there. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and put the shock cord back down through the motor mount again. And we're just a little bit too tall for my camera. There we go, and just pull that on down once more. Okay, so now we'll try and take a look in here. Alright, so that's out of the way, and now we need to put in, again, some fairly heavy glue fillets around the outside and the inside there. I think a cotton applicator is going to be the easiest way to do it. Now I am getting a lot on the side of the tube, and that's not going to be a big deal. As when I'm done here, I'll stand the tube up so that gravity works to fall back down onto the rings. Okay, now I can get the shock cord where it comes out of the ring, but we want to make sure we don't get it on the shock cord beyond that, which is part of the reason I sent it back down the tube. Alright, so we've got some healthy fillets going on there. I'm just going to fill in any gaps. Okay, so this is the end of part 1 of this build video, and I'm going to set this aside to dry for at least an hour, and then when we come back we'll start putting the fins on. We'll have the fins all finished by then off camera, and so we'll be ready to mark this for the fins and the launch lug and get those on, and then put the whole rocket together.